Alright, let's now talk about the making of the Hawse pieces at the bow. Before we start the making, we need to prepare these parts. These parts include few plywood parts, and some other sheet parts. Firstly, let's focus on the plywood parts. It's cut from this thin layer board. These parts are B4, B5, 3B7, and 1B6. Additionally, there are a few parts here, and you can easily identify these on the sheet. Of course, mine has been sanded, and I'll explain the sanding part later. In summary, there are several parts to locate. Apart from these, you also need to prepare a piece like this. This is the final cant frame at the bow, specifically X8, the one closest to the bow. I've already sanded the outer side according to the sanding lines. The inner side hasn't been sanded yet because we currently lack a reference for sanding. However, on the upper side, I've sanded off a small portion to create a slight slope. This slope can be adjusted as needed to ensure better fitting onto the template we'll install later. Additionally, there are two small bars. The upper one is on the W sheet, and you can find it on the right side with the label 3. The other bar is a random corner piece taken from the sheets. You can find similar corner pieces with a thickness of 0.5 mm. The main point is to prepare these components, both of which have a thickness of 0.5 mm. Next, let's proceed with the assembly of this template. Before assembling the template, we can first sand the sides a bit to ensure a better fit. Sometimes, the thickness of the layer board may not be precisely uniform, so a slight sanding might be needed. However, it shouldn't require too much sanding. I did a simple sanding, and it fits in well. After a mock assembly, you can gauge how much sanding might be necessary. For these B7 pieces, there have been some modifications in later versions. However, in the earlier versions, you might need to remove a bit on the inner side to facilitate better installation onto B4. Otherwise, the installation process might be a bit challenging. Although it can still be installed without this modification, it may be a bit tricky. This adjustment will make the installation much simpler. When you're installing it, start by fitting one end here, and after sanding, it should fit in smoothly. Once one end is secured, you can easily insert the remaining two. Great, now all three of these B7 pieces have been installed onto B4. After completing the installation of these three, let's move on to installing B6 at this position. For B6, you can do a simple sanding on the outer contour to ensure a better fit with frame X8. The goal is to ensure that X8 aligns with the line below. As you can see, there's a line here. Achieving a smooth alignment with the contour would be good. If the outer contour isn't perfectly aligned, especially in the midsection upwards from here, you might need to do a bit more sanding. However, excessive sanding shouldn't be necessary. Once we've assembled B6, we can proceed to assemble B5. Similarly, if it doesn't fit snugly, you can sand it a bit to ensure a better fit. However, don't make it too loose. If it's too loose, the entire structure might be wobbly. In my case, there's a bit of resistance when fitting it in, and it snugly fits, which is ideal. That's it, the piece is in place. For added stability, you can apply a bit of glue on the outer facade, just for reinforcement. But regardless, this completes our template. Next, for the parts we identified earlier, we need to perform an inner sanding on them. Of course, I've already completed this sanding. The sanding process is the same for all pieces that require it. You follow the sanding lines and sand towards the inner side. However, you may find on some pieces, especially if you have an older version, a sanding line drawn on this side. Ignore this sanding line, it is incorrect. But, if you happen to have this sanding line, you can use it as a reference. On the other side, at an equal height, perform a sanding with the slant. For example, on one side, you sand at an angle, and on the other side, you sand with a counter slant. Once you've completed this sanding, you can assemble them onto the template. Now, during assembly, let's start by placing X8. I want to emphasize that if you haven't sanded the slant here, it might not fit properly in this area, and it might protrude slightly. So, make sure to sand this area to fit. After sanding, you might notice that it doesn't align perfectly with the outer contour. That's okay, as long as it fits well here after sanding, the rest doesn't matter. Also, concerning the outer contour line here, ensure that it precisely covers this contour line. You can see a very faint outline here, ensuring this level of precision. In actual making, the precision can then be more controllable. For this piece, you can put a little bit of glue on top. Don't use too much. Just apply a small amount to fix its position. A tiny bit of glue here will secure it and prevent it from wobbling during making and affecting the overall position. Then that's it. Alright, next, we'll proceed to assemble these Hawse pieces one by one. Firstly, both sides need a slight sanding, as there might be some carbon black marks left on both sides that need to be sanded out. If possible, you can also slightly thin it out during the sanding process. I'll explain why we want to sand it a bit thinner in a moment. Let's start with the sanding. Once that's done, you can see these corresponding positions on the top. If you don't sand this piece, you'll notice it protruding a bit. It will be higher than the groove position, possibly halfway into the groove. This can affect the groove and subsequently impact the following components. So, remember to sand it slightly, and both sides can undergo a simple sanding. After sanding, we can take this slightly narrower piece, just find some leftover material, 0.5 mm thick, and cut a piece. After cutting, insert it into this gap. Sometimes you may find it doesn't fit, in which case, sand it a bit thinner until it fits. Alright, once it fits, proceed to the next step. Now, take this first piece and fit it over here. Apply glue on the bottom and a little on the top to ensure it adheres both to this piece and the part below. For the bottom, if you're confident in using wood glue, go ahead, otherwise, you can use an alternative method like instant glue. The key is to ensure a secure bond. Alright, so with this, the assembly is complete. After completing the assembly, we'll take a slightly wider piece from sheet W and use it to reinforce the structure on both sides here. Now, this reinforcement is also done, and I want to remind you that when gluing the part below, if you find it's not sticking well, it's highly likely that the angle is not correct. Be sure to confirm that the angle at the bottom is correct. Here, I haven't glued it perfectly, it's better to let it protrude a bit, something like this. Regarding the spacer, I recommend installing it around this position because this is where the hawse holes are. On a real ship, it should be around this position. We also use this to provide a reinforcement to ensure correctness. However, if you prefer, you can also glue the spacer underneath, which may not be as accurate, but it will still provide stability. Alternatively, you can choose to glue it in the middle, but in that case, it will be visible if glued. Anyway, let's proceed to glue the next piece. For the next piece, it's the same process, glue it accordingly. However, during the gluing process, pay attention to placing a 0.5 mm shim here at the bottom. This is because there should be a 0.5 mm gap between them, and now we already have two spacers on top, ensuring the correct width. So at the bottom, we also need another 0.5 mm spacer, make sure not to glue it on. Then apply glue for the hawse piece and proceed with the assembly. You can also pre-apply glue to these two spacers in advance and then proceed with the assembly. Alright, so now the second piece has also been glued. For the subsequent pieces, I won't demonstrate each one individually, but they are produced in the same way. I'll provide an explanation when we reach the last two pieces. One point to note is that, during the process, intermittently lift the glued section and check the inner side. Ensure that the inner side does not have significant protrusions or indentations. If you are unsure initially, you can complete two pieces and then inspect. After confirming that these two are fine, proceed with the rest in the same rhythm. As you can see now, the height matches the contour on this side, but in previous attempts, there were instances of a slightly lower or higher height. Therefore, pay attention to this and, after confirming, reattach it. Actually, now, when you reattach it, with the spacer serving as a positioning guide and the entire structure already fixed, whether or not you apply glue doesn't make a significant difference. Alright, so at this point, we have completed the gluing of the previous pieces. I'll remind you again during gluing to pay attention to this area above, ensuring it fits tightly against this B6. After gluing, you can also use liquid instant glue to infiltrate into the reinforced spacer blocks and the connections below. Because we will do some sanding later, if there are instabilities in these areas, you might encounter problems during the sanding process. Moving forward, we are now going to install the last two pieces. For the last piece, you may notice that after installing it, the slope here is not quite right. This slope has a slight excess, so we need to adjust it accordingly. When adjusting the inner side of this piece, be sure to perform mock assemblies multiple times to see its best fitted state before final installation. Okay, after some sanding, this piece has been sanded to approximately this state. The inner side, which is adjacent to Y8, also needs to be sanded. Then, on the inner side, this side also needs to be sanded. In short, after sanding, we can see that after removing from the platform, it can actually achieve a good fit. When sanding, be sure to do more adjustments so that it can achieve a good fit on the top side. Then, when installing, we still need to use the template as before, ensuring a good fit inside. Next, we can place it back on the template, glue this piece, and finally, glue the last piece. After gluing the penultimate piece, we then proceed to glue the final small piece. For the final piece, we first need to sand its inner side according to the sanding lines. The final piece doesn't require spacer blocks, as there is no space to place them. We put it in this position, and you can see that it can be tightly fitted if you sand it properly. Then, we directly glue it, ensuring its height is roughly level with the previous pieces. If it's slightly higher than the front part, it doesn't matter, as we can flatten it all at once later. Alright, at this stage, our assembly is complete. Next, we need to sand it. For sanding, you can refer to this and sand it until you can't see any carbon black. The inner side can also be sanded, but you can leave the X8 part for now. Okay, at this point, the sanding is done, and it looks like this. Do some sanding on both the inner and outer sides. For the outer side, sand until it's smooth and free of carbon black. For the inner side, make it even, and that's basically it.